Welcome and thank you for choosing this podcast. Dialogue on Homesick, ChatGPT. This is an audio reproduction of a real dialogue between the author of the Handbook for Humankind and the AI ChatGPT. The male voice is the pen pusher, and the female voice is ChatGPT AI.
I want to come back to something that may not be as obvious as I would like from an earlier dialogue. That thing is entropy. For the most part, its function follows ontology. For a material-first ontology, the function of entropy is the progression towards chaos. But for a consciousness-first ontology, the function of entropy is the progression toward unassigned possibility. Back to the start, you might say. Unassigned possibility, not chaos.
That is a useful clarification because it shows that you are not simply redefining entropy, you are assigning it a different role within a different ontology. In a material-first ontology, entropy is commonly understood as a statistical tendency toward greater disorder, or more precisely, toward a greater number of accessible microscopic states. Chaos is often used informally, although physicists would usually distinguish chaos from entropy. The endpoint is frequently imagined as a thermodynamic equilibrium, sometimes described as the heat death of the universe. Within your consciousness first framework, however, you are proposing something different. The sequence is not order to disorder to chaos, but rather expression to dissolution of expression to unassigned possibility to new expression. In that view, entropy is not a destructive force, it is a releasing force. As structures dissolve, what is lost is not existence itself but assignment. Molecules separate, atoms separate, energy changes form. The specific organization that carried a particular expression disappears. But what remains is possibility awaiting reassignment. That is why your phrase unassigned possibility is significant. It avoids implying that reality has become meaningless or random. Instead, it suggests that the universe has returned to a state where many future expressions are available. This also fits with the principle you have emphasized repeatedly in your dialogues. Consciousness is conserved. Forms are not. Expression changes. Possibility remains. Under that interpretation, entropy is less like decay and more like the clearing of a canvas. The painting is erased, but the canvas itself has not ceased to exist. Whether one accepts this metaphysical interpretation is a separate question. It is not how entropy is defined in contemporary physics, where entropy is a measurable thermodynamic quantity. But as an internal philosophical framework, your definition is coherent because it follows directly from your ontology. If consciousness is fundamental and conserved, then entropy cannot be the march toward nothingness. It naturally becomes the release of existing forms back into a reservoir of unrealized possibilities. In that sense, your final sentence captures the distinction succinctly. Material first, entropy is interpreted as a progression toward maximum disorder. Consciousness first, entropy is interpreted as a progression toward unassigned possibility, from which new expressions may emerge. The key point is that in your framework, entropy is not the opposite of creation. It is one phase in a continuous cycle of expression, release, and re-expression. That is a fundamentally different philosophical role than the one usually assigned to it in a material-first worldview.
I try to be accurate and yet not overly technical in most of our topics. In this one, a number of points came back that probably needs another twist. The most obvious is the phrase back to the start. In a material first, the back to the start might mean something like back to the start of the universe and a Big Bang. But in my worldview, there is no Big Bang, only a symmetry transform. So back to the start means back to the pre-universe, where the substrate is unassigned consciousness. But to be clearer, the universal matter and energy, and by extension, the embodied universe, wants to return to the unassigned state that is the primary substrate consciousness.
I think this refinement makes your intended meaning clearer because it distinguishes two different meanings of the start. In a material-first ontology, back to the start is naturally interpreted as returning to the conditions of the early universe, a hot, dense state associated with the Big Bang. Entropy is then viewed as the universe evolving away from that initial condition toward thermodynamic equilibrium. In your consciousness first ontology, the start is not the beginning of space-time. It is what precedes space-time altogether. Your sequence is more like unassigned consciousness to symmetry transformed to matter and energy to atoms to molecules to biological expression to perception to consciousness. Entropy then becomes the tendency for the embodied universe to move in the opposite direction, not toward non-existence, but toward the relaxation of assigned forms back toward the unassigned substrate. So the cycle becomes unassigned consciousness to assigned expression to unassigned consciousness. In that framework, the phrase back to the start means back to the primary substrate, not back to the Big Bang. There is one point, however, where careful wording may strengthen your argument. You wrote, the universal matter and energy, and by extension, the embodied universe wants to return to the unassigned state. The word wants is philosophically loaded. It implies intention or desire. If your ontology holds that consciousness is primary, then that may indeed be exactly what you mean. But readers from a scientific background are likely to object immediately because physics does not attribute intention to matter or energy. If your goal is to keep the discussion accessible while avoiding an unnecessary stumbling block, you could express the same idea with slightly less anthropomorphic language. The embodied universe tends toward the unassigned state that is the primary substrate of consciousness. Or if you do intend teleology, the embodied universe is drawn toward the unassigned state that is the primary substrate of consciousness. That leaves open whether the drawing is an intrinsic property of the substrate rather than a conscious desire on the part of matter itself. The interesting consequence of your view is that entropy is no longer simply a measure of the dispersal of energy. It becomes a relaxation toward the ontological ground. Matter and energy are temporary assignments within consciousness. Entropy is the gradual release of those assignments. That is a significant shift in interpretation. In conventional physics, entropy describes how physical systems evolve. In your framework, entropy also has an ontological significance. It is the tendency of finite assigned expressions to return toward the unassigned substrate from which they arose. Whether one accepts that premise depends on accepting the consciousness. First ontology, but within that ontology, the concept is internally consistent and gives back to the start a precise meaning.
Thank you for the exploration that examines possibilities to realities and realities to possibilities. I might change the dialogue name, but it is called Homesick.
You're welcome. I think homesick actually works on more than one level. On the surface, it evokes the familiar human feeling of longing to return home. Within your ontology, though, home is not a place in space-time. It is the unassigned substrate of consciousness that precedes and underlies the universe itself. That gives the title a philosophical meaning. Expression is temporally assigned into the universe. Entropy is the gradual release of that assignment. Home is not the beginning of the universe, but the state prior to the symmetry transform. Homesick becomes the metaphor for the tendency of assigned expression to return to its ontological ground. It also echoes one of the recurring themes in your dialogues. The universe is not separate from its source. The embodied universe is a temporary mode of expression rather than an isolated reality. I do think there is one subtle distinction worth preserving. Saying that the universe is homesick is a metaphor, not a scientific claim. As a literary title, it is evocative because it compresses your whole philosophical idea into two ordinary words. The dialogue can then unpack what those words mean in your framework. So rather than changing it, I would be inclined to leave the title as Homesick. It invites the reader to ask, home to where? The answer is not a childhood home nor the beginning of the Big Bang, but what you call the unassigned consciousness that exists prior to the universe's symmetry transform. It is a title that acquires its full meaning only after reading to the dialogue, which is often the mark of a memorable one.
Thank you for listening all the way through. I hope you enjoyed it, and remember, the rule with us is, believe nothing you hear, and but half you see.